world petrol prices may increase after some top oil-producing countries agreed to cut the amount they export. They include Saudi Arabia and Russia, who are part of the OPEC Plus group of petroleum-exporting countries. The group wants to cut production by 2 million barrels a day. Now, to speak about what this all means, I'm joined by economist Professor Patrick Bond. Professor, good morning, and thank you very much for your time. Now, this decision by OPEC members has already seen oil prices shoot up by Wednesday already, but the real extent of the impact is what we seek to understand today. Can you just take us through this?
Yes, it's great to be with you and the viewers. Thanks, Mfunda. I think the dilemma is we're in a geopolitically fluid situation, and there's a U.S. election, which means that although Joe Biden had gone to Saudi Arabia, the key force in OPEC, the largest producer, back in July, and he'd really begged for more production to lower prices. And you see that at that point, prices were coming down. They peaked at $120 a barrel in May, and they've gone down as low as $80. But in the meantime, Saudi Arabia and some of the other major oil exporters have been wooed by China, and then the Russian losses in the Ukraine are compelling Russia to rethink how it plays in the world market. So it's had a strong de facto alliance with OPEC and OPEC Plus, it's part of. And that means they want to have prices up, which means they're putting production down now by 2 million barrels a day. That's the biggest decline since the big economic crash of 2020 due to COVID-19 lockdowns.
And what are ordinary people reading into this geopolitical shift? Because here you had the West looking to perhaps restrict the oil income from Russia. But now, with this decision by Saudi Arabia and the other countries, it seems as though, it would seem to others as though they're siding with Russia.
Oh, yes, the OPEC group, according to Biden, has now made a very clear statement that does back Vladimir Putin, because Putin, in a sense, with the big BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, to be hosted here next year in South Africa, they've really decided to make this a proxy war, not just an invasion of Ukraine. And in putting sanctions on Russia back in March, including oil and gas sanctions, and with the explosion of the Nord Stream pipeline, there's a lot of tension and also an expectation in Europe of a very cold winter with insufficient energy supplies. But Biden's also facing an election, the midterm elections that will determine whether his Congress, his House and Senate, go to the Republican side, which seems somewhat likely. So he wants lower prices. Now, all of these processes are in play as China recommends expanding the BRICS to include Saudi Arabia. That was a push by the foreign minister earlier this year, and also Egypt, which next month is hosting the big climate summit. We're in a situation, of course, South Africa tap dances on this minefield, with Ramaphosa going to see Biden, with our foreign minister, Naledi Pandor, hosting the U.S. foreign minister just a few weeks ago. And so South Africa kind of looks to the West, but has this foot in the BRICS and is a very uneasy purchaser of much more expensive oil as a result of this decision as well. I think we're going to see, a return to the anger in the streets, because oil prices will be going up in coming weeks. And as the rand goes down against the dollar, that will become even worse.
So for the ordinary citizen now at home who wants to know when exactly the retailer is now going to somehow impose these increases as they start to feel the pressure, because some even believe we might not necessarily see a significant increase.
Well, we've had such high increases, and they did peak. As I say, the May this year was the $120 per barrel peak, and we were down to as low as 80. But as I say, the decline of the rand against the dollar, as other commodity prices also have gone down, has really put that pressure, as you say, on the ordinary person. Now, if you're someone who mainly uses petrol indirectly because you're a combi passenger, that becomes a very interesting opening for the state to finally come to grips with the fact that the combi passengers, 80% of the working class, are not subsidized. Whereas if I get on a Gautrain or take an SAA flight, I mean, there are huge subsidies. 100 Rand a trip on a Gautrain for basically elites, or for SAA, 1,000 Rand per ticket has been the tradition. Those sorts of state subsidies that help some people get ahead in transport. Now there'll be more pressure. And, we've seen this sort of civil unrest and riots and protests, not just here, but across the world, over rising energy. And it may be a determinant factor, as Cyril Ramaphosa himself has an electoral battle in December, and then, of course, in 2024.
And it is an age-old debate around whether or why we haven't seen subsidizing in this particular mode of transportation, because it transports the majority when we speak of taxis or combis. But if we had to look at the reasoning around this increase, I know US President Joe Biden maintains the decision is very short-sighted, but if we take a look back, we last saw a reduction of this kind back in 2020 at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, but many of us understood that one. The economies had shut down, there was very little demand for oil. But this time around, they say it's to stabilize prices which have fallen. Now, the big question from ordinary citizens would be, is this the ideal route to take in mitigating the slower world economy?
Well, I think everybody who's aware of climate will say no, reduce production and rapidly move to renewable energy, including, electric vehicles. And that may be some announcements in the next few days about South Africa's move with the $8.5 billion promised by the West to decarbonize. That'll be both on the coal-fired power plants, although there's a danger it may bring in methane gas, but also on electric vehicles. So obviously that's the longer-term route. And with gas prices now, oil prices $93 a barrel, it does also open one other geopolitical let's say, a window for Joe Biden that he's always kept shut, and that is Venezuela. So Saudi Arabia is the biggest, but the actual biggest reserves are held by Venezuela, which is run by a government. Nicolas Maduro is the president, which is very hostile to the U.S., and the U.S. has put sanctions and expropriated its wealth, its gold, and its petrol stations, and so forth. So I think if there's some easing between the U.S. and Venezuela because of this, Venezuela, a core member of Opec and revitalized it about 20 years ago under Hugo Chavez, that'll be all to the good. And the extent to which Biden is very nervous about the election, which could turn, the U.S. Parliament, the Congress, to the far right under sort of Trump influence. And if he's able to increase the reserves they have there to keep the prices a bit lower, that's all to his benefit. And he's very angry. And if it does mean that he, again, raises the Saudi Arabia human rights questions, the lack of democracy, the patriarchy, the fact that Saudi Arabia is basically a fascist dictatorship, well, that'll also be to the good if there's more pressure there instead of his wishy-washy stance in July.
Professor, I love how you take us through the real politics of it all, because some could have easily assumed that these were economic considerations. But clearly there's more at play here if you're even looking at the fact that we've got a Joe Biden who's seeking re-election, that clearly there's a lot, and it would be to his disadvantage if he doesn't somehow contain the skyrocketing oil prices.
Yes, and also for us, Ramaphosa has to be acutely aware that the rising cost of living and inflated food prices, Vladimir Putin's lock on grain in eastern Ukraine and Russia, the lack of vegetable oil, all of these price hikes are on everyone's mind still today, even as they've sort of tempered. And we have 7.5% inflation, and workers are kind of taking a 3% increase, a big cut, in other words, in the public sector. The teachers this week, there's a big strike at Transnet over exactly this. We're in a very tense society. And then at some point next year, we're not sure when and where, South Africa will host the BRICS, and we'll be right in the middle of the big geopolitical game.
No, nothing is as it seems in politics and the economy. Professor, thank you very much for your time this morning. That's economist Professor Patrick Bond.